Hello, my name is Connor with Virginia Stage Company. I'm excited to welcome you to this interview with Courtney Mohler, our dramaturg and cultural consultant for VSC's production of The Thanksgiving Play, written by Larissa Fasthorse on the Wells Theater stage now through February 6th. Courtney, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to get to work with Jessica and the cast and you all at Virginia Stage Company.
Well, just to get started so that we can introduce you to our patrons and our guests of the theater, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of what you do in the world of theater, a little bit about how you got into theater, and just, introduce yourself a little bit to us.
I'm Courtney Mohler, and I am from Santa Barbara, California, originally. I was really lucky to grow up being a very dramatic child, and so my parents put me into drama lessons as a kid, and I ended up majoring in theater with an emphasis in acting and critical studies at UCLA. And when I was there, I was really fortunate to study under Hene Gigoma, who is a Kiowa, Delaware playwright, and I knew that I had Native ancestry. I am Santa Barbara Chumash on my dad's side, but I didn't really have any idea that there was such a thing as Native American theater. And so my love of theater is probably like a lot of yours. I love everything from musicals to Shakespeare. I love American ethnic theater and contemporary American plays. But my heart is in Native American theater, and particularly in kind of play development whenever I get an opportunity to develop a play by a contemporary playwright. And that all happened because I knew I loved theater. I knew a little bit about my ancestral lineage, but I didn't know that there was such a thing as Native American theater till I got to UCLA and was sort of taken under the wing of Professor Hene Gigoma. And that really changed kind of the course of my life. I decided to dedicate my professional life to dramaturgy, directing, and also, writing scholarly work on Native American theater, and I knew by the time I was maybe 19 that I wanted to be a professor of theater. So that's what I do.
You teach theater at Butler, correct?
I do. I'm in charge of all of the kind of critical analysis and theater history text analysis courses, and I also direct for our program here. And I am really interested in working with students and turning them on to the incredible pleasure of deep research in doing practical theater work.
Well, I guess, with getting so in depth into the research of that, I guess it makes perfect sense why we would have had you on as a dramaturg and a cultural consultant for this production. For some of our patrons and guests who might not know, what is a dramaturg exactly, and what's their role in the creation of a production or work on a production?
So dramaturgy is hard to define, and part of the reason why it's hard to define is that the best dramaturg's work is invisible when you are sitting in the audience. I think there's a great a line about dramaturgy, people are always asking me, what did you do in this production? And I say, well, you can't really see it, but if you were to take a knife to this production, it would bleed me. And I love that kind of visual. A dramaturg, there's two different kinds of dramaturgs. There's the kind that are in the play development process, and I'll just very briefly touch on that because that really wasn't my role in this particular production. But a development dramaturg will work with a playwright, and sometimes if they're lucky, also a team of actors and a director to kind of go through script rewrites to make sure that if there's anything that the director, design team, or actors need explained or researched, that they can be a provided resource for that, for the creative and artistic team. But they also will work on all the different drafts with the playwright and make sure that that the characters' voices, don't blend in together, that time tracks if it needs to track, that the tone stays consistent, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But a production dramaturg, which is what I'm doing with you all, takes a script that has already been produced, that it's in its final form, and helps figure out what this particular group of people and artists needs and audience needs in order to best tell this story. Whether that means explaining to the casting crew some of the terminology or the culture that might be behind the way that the story is told, if it's kind of explaining perhaps the politics, in this case for this play, what does it mean to Indigenous people to be reduced to a history, to 1 month, to have a Native American Heritage Month, or to be thought of as welcoming to pilgrims in the Thanksgiving story. It may very well be that a lot of the people working on this production don't have any previous experience with an Indigenous point of view in that matter. And so my job would be to research that, to convey, maybe do little mini lectures, work with the designers and the director to make sure that the story that Larissa Fasthorse has created and the vision that Jessica Holt as the director has for the play match up to create the most fun, interesting, and thought-provoking story for the audience.
That definition you gave, I think, is such a good way to put it, that when you've worked dramaturgy for a show and you get to watch that experience and knowing that oh, that was a conversation I was part of, or oh, that's something they're delivering that changed based on a nugget of information that they gleaned from a packet or this mini lecture. That, that part of it is work. I think sometimes our, folks will come in and think, oh, these actors, they're so brilliant. They know everything and they've learned everything and they've come into this, and they do a lot of that work. But there's also a big research component that's done in prep for that show.
Yeah, another thing I'd like to say about dramaturgy, because I do love to talk about it, is that it's like you get to be a therapist for the play, and in the best possible way. And so I do think that the best dramaturgs are gentle, supportive, positive askers of why. So you gently ask, if you're helping develop a play, really, what do you see here? Why is that? Why is this character saying this here? Why is this moment happening? And you do the same thing with the director. And of course, you also are a recipient of a lot of whys. So it may be that as an actor, we have an impulse to love and want to connect with our characters, which makes perfect sense. That's a great way to become the characters, to find a way into their psyche. But sometimes, a dramaturg might be there to let them know, it's okay that this thing is something you don't relate to. They can be there along with the director to make sure that it's kind of like an added support system, so that you have a team of people saying, hey, what are you thinking about? And how can I talk to you about the different questions that you have, so that we can come to a new place with whatever your perspective on this moment or this costume or this line or this character might be.
How did you end up getting involved with this creative team on this production?
This is a universe serendipity kind of situation. I think that the short story is that Jessica reached out to a mutual professional acquaintance of ours named Madeline Sayette, who's a Mohegan director, and knew that I did dramaturgy and direction because she had come to Butler and worked with our students for a project. And I don't know how Jessica and Madeline knew each other, but she connected with Madeline and Madeline gave her my name. That's the short version. But it turns out Jessica and I knew each other previously through a dear friend that we have, that one of my very, very best friends' husband, and he's one of my best friends too, knew Jessica since I think our early 20s. So it's very exciting. And we just happened to realize, oh, we do know each other. This is fantastic. But we never had the opportunity to work together before.
And now, you all have been working together, and, not only working together, but also working together in this, from a distance COVID/weird world. There's a lot of fortunateness when you're able to get the actors, the director, and the dramaturg all in the same room working through that process. But for this one, you've been all remote in working with all of our folks. How has that been, or how has that changed things as far as a process for you?
I feel like there's nothing like the magic of a rehearsal room. I love to be in them. But I will say, as somebody, I'm a full-time professor, a full-time mom, and the associate dean for, we call it IDEA, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access here for the Jordan College of Arts. And so my ability to be in Virginia right now, I don't have that ability to do it, throughout the whole rehearsal process. And so the sad thing about that is that they're denied an in-rehearsal dramaturg. But the positive thing about it is that they get me. And I know that sounds like, but if I'm the right person for this particular production, and I hope I have been, then I get to be with them in a way that works for my schedule. And so I think that's a really great added thing. I feel like dramaturgy is one of those areas, particularly when you are not developing a play, in which case I advocate for the dramaturg, like being in constant communication with the playwright. And that is really what, like, well facilitated by in presence time, in real life time. but you can do dramaturgy remotely effectively, I think. And I do believe that more theater companies are doing the right thing, which is diversifying what they're offering and realizing that they need the extra support that a dramaturg can provide. And this way, you can have an expert that lives in a different area be kind of in the room because of the magic of Zoom.
It's that light in the darkness moment where it's, we can't have more folks in person, but through becoming masters of Zoom and Google Meet and all those things that we've learned over the course of the year and that technical literacy, it, allows more and more theaters the ability to to be able to find the right person, and then for that right person to not have to say no because circumstances can't allow them.
And I think it's letting companies that maybe would not be able to afford a dramaturg or think to themselves, well, we can't physically bring another artist here to the city and house them and whatever, but we certainly can be thoughtful with our time, get somebody who's experienced enough to know how to be, well planned with their time, to be efficient and substantive, and have some dramaturgy, which I always think is better than having none.
To shift gears and talk a little bit about the show itself, and a little bit of the work that you've done on this production, what are some, and I realize as I say those seemingly small words, but very broad and very big topics. What are some things that you'd like to share with our audience about kind of the relevance of this play's topics and the reason behind this play and those topics that have come to be?
I'm really lucky that I know Larissa Fasthorse personally. I've been able to work with her in the past. The Native theater community is pretty small, and that's a really wonderful thing. Now, of course, she's hugely famous, and I'm so proud of her and excited to be able to name drop her. I think that I want people to know that Larissa believes that her work in theater is social activism. And I'm quoting her when I say that, so I know that I'm, representing what she would want you to know. She believes that theater, all theater, but particularly the theater that she creates through her playwriting, and also she sometimes is a lot of times in creation with community, is about bridging non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities together and helping them see each other and talk to each other. And I don't at all mean to say that she's looking for a kumbaya moment, because I don't think that is accurate. I think that it's that for many Native people, Indigenous people, Indigenous stories have been largely left out of the national story. The perspective of Indigenous peoples has been left out, and instead we get things that are maybe more sanitized for the majority culture, like the Pocahontas story or Sacagawea leading, Lewis and Clark, or the Thanksgiving story. And I think that Larissa, in all of her work, is really interested in creating a play world that has hyper-realistic dialogue and situations, but that the overall play is kind of a metaphor for something that's meaningful for that connection and communication that I was just talking about, where even though this play, she purposely wrote a play that could be played by white presenting actors. And she did that for a variety of reasons. And I think that when you see the whole play, I hope that some of them will dawn on you. But it doesn't mean that the play doesn't still have that social activist agenda as part of it. And particularly, I think that the metaphor that the play creates really, it helps articulate the invisibility that Native people have kind of unfortunately been forced to inhabit. And the fact that you have a lot of theater companies across the country, many, producing this work. And for many companies, it's the first work by an Indigenous playwright that they've done, and it features 4 white characters. I think that alone is something to make people pause and think for a second. Gee, why is that? Well, what does that say about how many Native actors we know in our community that we have, professionally engaged with? Perhaps it's a bit of a call that maybe we should think a little bit about having a connections with Indigenous actors, with professional Indigenous actors, so that we could tell a story, another one of Larissa Phasphorus's plays that does feature some Native characters, for example.
But I saw the Inheritance in New York, and was remembering similar conversations happening around white non-queer characters featuring in that story, and a similar interesting parallels to that conversation about the why, and the moment of seeing those moments and going, well, like Matthew Lopez, you're a queer person of color. Why didn't you create a story for and about those people? And, his responses, echoing Larissa's almost in some contexts of, these were the characters that the story was, but also think about why a story that would have been written that way wouldn't have gotten done, or wouldn't have gotten the attention that it's gotten. And it's just like, it's one of those moments where you see the one parallel and you think, oh, wow, that's a really, yeah. And then you see another and you're like, oh, this is a pattern. And then you see another and this is a trend.
Yes, exactly. And I'm even thinking of, Straight White Men, the play by Young Jean Lee, where she does have 2 non-binary trans-identified actors at the beginning that are the people in charge. But the play, I'm sorry, I'm stepping in and out of the light. The play is about, I think, 2 brothers and a father that are white straight men, and some of their kind of the sort of drama and pressures of being a white male, I guess. And, so we have, Brandon, I think that there's a few plays that are appropriate, this is sort of becoming a little bit of a, I don't want to say a genre, because I think that I don't want to belittle it or classify it before its time. But this is the first time American theater has really been opening up in a meaningful way to the perspectives of BIPOC artists. And so that is extremely exciting and rich theatrically, because it's an entire different point of view and worldview and perspective than we've really seen on the stage before. And I think that one of the things that people of color and people of color that are artists have to see and think about, and therefore is going to show up in their artwork, is how white people appear and interact and control things and talk about things, and the kind of humor that they, display or share. And that is a window into the perspective of BIPOC people that's really interesting. And I think it's interesting for anybody in the audience, because we've seen, white playwrights or white male perspective write jokes for white actors to portray on the stage a lot. And that is funny too. But now we're getting to see that interaction and those kind of comic relationships between white characters from the point of view of a BIPOC artist and playwright. And that's a very different kind of storytelling that I think is also going to be interesting and entertaining to anybody in the audience.
I always wondered, with shows like this, we did another production a year or two ago of Native Gardens, which had a lot of similar humor in the painting white characters through a BIPOC lens, their humor, and seeing how that appears and plays on stage. And plays like that have always interested me because, I'll speak from my family and my upbringing of a more Southern, more conservative white background, and sometimes certain shows would kind of rub them the wrong way. And I would always kind of go, why is that? It's because they are seeing themselves portrayed by people who are not like them, and they're not necessarily liking what that image is. And not the difficulty of realizing that that's something you can undo. It's work, but you can do that. But you can't be mad at how it looks, because how it looks is how it looks.
Yeah. And I think, just to advocate for BIPOC artists, there have mainly, let's talk about specifically Indigenous artists, almost all the representations and roles that have been available to Native people, until very recently, are crafted by non-Indigenous people. And so it is, I think those have been the roles that have been created. That's been the body of representation available. And that's finally shifting. And part of that shift is going to be that some Native people want to write roles that are also, of other kinds of people, which makes sense because white people have been doing that for a long time. They've been writing all different kinds of characters, right?
Right. And it becomes that expectation that, similar with Matthew Lopez and with Larissa as well, I'm sure, you have critics that are like, well, if you're going to write a work, why don't you write, for Matthew, why don't you write work about more Latinx queer people? And it's like, because white people get to write about whoever they want to write about, so why can't I?
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
Oh, man. Through your dramaturgy, through your work, what do you think, or what would you say is one of the, and I say one of because of how many there are, but if you had to pick kind of a key point or a key call to action, let's say, that you think audience members would or should reverberate with the most out of this production, what do you think that might be?
Well, I think any meaningful self-reflection, particularly for people who are in positions of social and political power, begins with self-reflection and reflecting on what you love and why, and the opportunities that you've had, and maybe some of the opportunities that other people don't have, and doing a little bit of that work. I recommend finding out and researching whose land you're on, and understanding and learning what settler colonialism means. If there's a tribal community that's in your community or surrounding your community, go and visit, talk to some people, find out what they know about the land, because they may have some specific directions for you about how to care for it better. And then I also would say, because I guess I'm, in the arts, and so this is meaningful to me, but I do think that representation matters. And I think that you have a voice as an audience member to like works that push you, that maybe push you to think differently, that give you a different perspective or lens to see the world. And Indigenous artists often, frequently, they have an activist agenda. Frequently, they're interested in environmental issues, in issues of bodily autonomy and the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and having there be visibility around settler colonialism, past, present, and hopefully not future, but future too. And I think that I want you to find as many Indigenous created theater, plays, movies, books, read them, and educate yourself, and try to include when you think about wanting to be inclusive of BIPOC perspectives, stories, and art, just don't forget the I, because it's easy to forget the I, and that's settler colonialism working. So, yeah.
One last question / maybe slight topic before we let you go. But, some of the things you talked about in terms of self-reflection and in terms of learning and growing your knowledge about the land that we're on and the land that is known. One of the things that our theater has adopted and that many theaters are starting to adopt, especially in the wake of the We See You in American Theater movement, has been land acknowledgements and the process of acknowledging the land that we're on prior to our productions, prior to engagement in our spaces. And, it's something that a lot of our patrons are newly being introduced to as we've been starting to become more regular with it in this season. And I was wondering if you could touch a little bit about that, especially you'd mentioned something too about kind of countries and other locations and kind of their reactions or their functionalities around land acknowledgements. So I was wondering if you could touch a little bit about, what is a land acknowledgement and what that relevance holds for Native American Indigenous peoples in their areas.
Yeah, I'll tell you, a land acknowledgement is meaningful if it's like a first step to repairing relationships between settler colonial peoples and Indigenous peoples. So acknowledging the land, knowing, hey, I'm here in Indianapolis, which is like the traditional lands of the Potawatomi, Miami, Kickapoo, Peoria, Delaware, and Shawnee people. That is a good first step because those people don't have land bases here in Indianapolis anymore. They were moved to different places, and it really shows me the reality of the land theft that, I benefit from to a certain extent. I own a house here on this land, right? But it has to be just a first step in becoming more responsible and respectful guests on the lands that Indigenous peoples have stewarded since time immemorial. And so I think by acknowledging the land, it invites those of us who, and I include myself in this, like I have settler colonial ancestry too, quite a bit of it. And so it invites those of us whose ancestors were not Indigenous to the land that we live on to consider the historical and the present context, right, of the land that we're on. And it also invites us to honor Indigenous peoples past, present, and future by enacting the Indigenous protocol of expressing gratitude, right? And being aware and focused on the importance of space and place so that we can reflect on how we can cultivate reparative justice with Indigenous communities for the benefit of the land and all of its inhabitants for all of the relations. That includes, of course, the swimming, the flying, the two-legged, the four-legged, all of the different nations of people and ancestors and those 7 generations ahead of us. And of course, the rooted and, our plant and animal life as well. So yeah, that's why we do it.
I had this conversation with my parents actually really recently. 'Cause, we were working on the, putting the land acknowledgement in our playbill and all of the plans around that. They heard me talking about the language a lot, and it interested them first from the learning the names and learning the tribes to know on our area, things that they didn't know that was just oh, wow, I didn't know this. Why is this happening just now? Why is this a new thing that is starting to take shape? And, it kind of dawned on me of the work that had been done more than likely starting with land acknowledgements and going past in other countries like Australia, for example, where, you think about what the Indigenous population is like in that country now. And, they are the product of what that work gets to. But, we're now here trying to push that first step in order to start that process that we are, in my humble opinion, woefully behind on.
Well, I think it's really important to acknowledge that Indigenous communities are always like actively fighting for their rights and actively fighting for the promises that were made by the federal government, so either in Canada or in the United States, or you mentioned Australia. They're actively working for those global powers to recognize the treaty rights that were created originally, as a contract between two different nations. And I think that, like, it really is, again, it's just a first step, but having there be a common consciousness that indeed, like, these people are here, they were here first, and there are going to be legal battles. There are currently legal battles that assure their sovereignty and their ability to, and when I say sovereignty, I know that's a big word, but that assure that they have the ability as a tribal community to, govern themselves inside of their tribal lands, and that they can advocate for pan-tribal native causes on the national level as well. And I think that having the general population understand that Native people, one, exist, two, are in a settler colonial state. That's a hard thing to recognize. Mm-hmm. We think about, incursions abroad and, what's happening with Ukraine and why is Russia trying to take over there, or, what's happening with the Palestine-Israeli conflict. And I mean, obviously, these are geopolitical issues that are extraordinarily complex and people have very strong opinions about them. But I don't think that the average school student, for example, thinks, America is a settler colonial state. And I think that if, like, having, maybe it just is a little bit like, at first it's just, I just acknowledge it. But I do think it invites people to consider some of the real tangible and material things that go along with the fact that we're on land that, the United States made promises to certain people in order to take, and frequently those promises have been broken and continue to be broken.
Mm-hmm. School student and school education and knowledge about subjects like this is, a very key point of of where the conversation can start and be honest. Like we go into, just like you said, about acknowledging what this country is and what obstacles exist for its Native American indigenous populations, and just acknowledging that truth. Not doing it gets us the story of Thanksgiving and the history that is taught in our schools and in our places today. And then, we get to this point of relying on artists like Larissa Fasthorse, like the directors and dramaturgs like you that work on these works, that help to share these stories in a venue where those things can't be so easily whitewashed or can't be so easily censored. And, I hope similarly, just with Larissa's goals of activism and theater, that making that conversation and those conversations more mainstream in the theater and arts world will eventually allow it to permeate the educational world and eventually get us to that point where, every student can, because, we can all come together and say, like, there are horrendous things throughout the United States past that have to be unpacked and have to be addressed, but you can't cover them up or vanish them because they're all equal parts of what brought us to where we are now.
Right. I do think, look up, the Water is Life movement, like, think about the pipelines and what that means when oil companies are drilling through sacred waters and lands of Native peoples. And it actually, it means something for all of us because we all live in one planet with connected water systems. And, if you don't know who the missing and murdered Indigenous women are and the activists that are dedicated to visibilizing and advocating for finding, and getting justice for those women, then that's like a great first stop at Google to take, because I think that we don't want to just, like, it's not that useful to just feel guilty about transgressions that happened hundreds of years ago. Like, that's not actually a very useful, in terms of activism or change, it's not really that useful. So I know that these artists, and myself included, and Larissa, is not really interested in white guilt. But I think that having the impulse to figure out what's happening right now that is connected with colonialism is quite important. And that's where you actually have room to make a shift in how you vote, what you buy, who you speak with, and whose voices you lift up, through your choices of being an audience member, or your choices of who you include in your syllabus if you're a teacher, that kind of thing.
Well, Courtney, thank you again so much for all of this. I mean, this has just been a treat, from all of your discussions about dramaturgy that's going to share great information with our patrons, to even just this conversation. I think it's going to add a huge and wonderful understanding about the context of this play, the context of this work, and what our patrons can do to continue to get engaged and, like you said, be able to, understand white guilt, but also understand where that can be more powerfully, constructively directed into action after the production.
Absolutely. And buy Indigenous art. Yay.
That, especially that. No, thank you again so much. And we look forward to sharing these words with our patrons, and continuing the conversation around this play as we run through the remainder of January.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you.
Thank you. You as well.